Well, good morning. The Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will come to order, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. And again, thank you very much to our witnesses for being here today to examine the importance of AM radio receivers and vehicles. AM radio has been an integral part of our society for well over a century, connecting Americans to local news and serving as the backbone to our nation's emergency communications infrastructure. Over 45 million Americans tune into AM radio each month. They rely on it for local news, weather, sports, and emergency alerts. Its unique frequency characteristics allow signals to travel far and wide, overcoming geographical barriers and reaching both urban and remote areas. This makes AM radio an invaluable tool during times of crisis. When hurricanes, tornadoes, or other natural disasters strike, AM radio remains steadfast, providing vital information to those in affected areas when other communication channels fail. In fact, a few years ago when I was traveling through my district, when it came on the radio, there was a tornado on the ground. I switched to my local AM radio station playing in real-time weather alerts that allowed me to know the exact path of the tornado. With that information, I was able to safely travel home, avoiding the storm's path. In times of emergency, information is power, and AM radio remains a primary source for emergency reports. Local broadcasters have long served as the trusted voice, delivering real-time updates, weather alerts, evacuation instructions, and other critical information that can mean the difference between life and death. Beyond emergency situations, AM radio plays a key role in local news and community engagement. From news and cultural events to sports coverage and talk shows, AM radio keeps us connected to our communities. These stations provide a platform for discussion, education, and entertainment. Importantly, AM radio reaches a wide demographic, ranging from seniors to rural and underserved communities. It serves as a source of information that is accessible to all, regardless of socioeconomic status or access to the internet. Today's hearing is a result of announcements made by many auto manufacturers that they intend to remove AM radio in certain vehicles due to the interference between the AM radio receivers and batteries in electric car vehicles. As some manufacturers shared in response to a letter I led last month with my colleague, the gentleman from Indiana's 6th District, the electromagnetic waves emitted by an electric vehicle's battery interfere with the incoming AM radio waves, causing the sound to buzz and fade. To solve this interference, some auto manufacturers are installing shields and filters to protect the receiver against this interference. In other cases, it appears that cars are equipping their new models with AM radio capability but have it disabled. However, some automakers are considering or are actively removing AM radio receivers from new vehicles altogether, regardless of engine type. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the public safety dangers of removing AM radio and possible solutions to combating signal interference. Removing AM radio receivers from vehicles means individuals may miss out on critical life-saving updates. We must ensure that no community is left behind, no voice is silenced, and no emergency response is compromised. Again, I want to thank our witnesses for being here, and I now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from the 7th District of California, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm glad we're holding this hearing today. While this issue has been gaining attention nationally, I think that this committee can help raise awareness among consumers. As I said in my statement announcing this hearing, AM radio provides Americans a crucial public service. Whether that's information during an emergency, local news, or community-specific programming, AM radio delivers for consumers. While the media landscape continues to evolve, AM radio remains a mainstay for millions of Americans. According to the National Association of Broadcasters, 82 million Americans listen to AM stations each month. For these consumers, AM radio is indispensable. But even for those of us who aren't listening daily, AM radio represents a critical lifeline when disaster strikes. Americans know all too well the need for diverse and redundant emergency notifications. During wildfires, texts, and other mobile alerts provide information that can save lives. But these notifications only work when mobile networks are still intact and operational. If they fail, as we've seen after wildfires, hurricanes, and tornadoes, we must have a backup. That's where AM radio comes into play, because the system is resilient and the spectrum can travel long distances. AM radio is a reliable backbone for emergency alert system. FEMA acknowledges this role when describing the emergency alert system, saying, in many cases, radio and TV stations continue to operate when other means of alerting the public are unavailable, providing a layer of resiliency. Many subscription services depend on internet access, and other public warning methods rely on utility power. In California, wildfires have destroyed cell towers and taken utility power down over large areas. For the many California families that have been forced to flee their homes without a mobile signal or power going out without AM radio, it'd be unthinkable and unacceptable. Imagine in that moment with your family in the car, frantically looking for emergency information, only to find out your car doesn't have an AM radio. I don't think anyone should have that experience. With more than 30 million vehicles registered in California, the loss of AM radio in cars will represent a devastating setback for emergency communications. But we know AM radio is more than just a lifeline during an emergency. For many, it represents an irreplaceable connection to their community. As local news options grow few and far between, AM radio offers free, hyper-local journalism. From high school football scores to city council coverage, AM radio can provide consumers with local coverage they can't get anywhere else. And in many areas, AM radio is broadcasting in Spanish, Vietnamese, and other languages spoken in the community. So in many ways, AM radio remains a lifeline. As we continue to push advances in mobility, it's important that we balance innovation with access. I'm hopeful this hearing will help us do just that. I'm excited to hear from our witnesses today, and with that, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back the balance of her time. The chair now recognizes 5 minutes. The chair of the full committee, the gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My constituents in Eastern Washington rely on AM radio. It's how they hear the news in their communities, listen to sports, and receive information during emergencies. In many parts of my district, FM radio is spotty, and there's no access to broadband. So AM radio is the only option, which is why it's concerning that some vehicle manufacturers have taken steps recently to remove AM radios from new car models. This is in part a result of the Biden administration's rush to a green agenda as they push for electric vehicles, because electric vehicle batteries cause interference to AM frequencies, resulting in bad reception. The decision to remove AM radio from cars would affect tens of millions of Americans. Some estimates suggest that more than 45 million Americans tune in to AM radio each month. While people in some parts of the country have been able to take advantage of alternative options in vehicles for accessing AM radio, like through a streaming service, many parts of the country still lack access to reliable broadband services, meaning this option is unavailable. That includes people in my community who are raising the alarm and sending the message that they like AM radio. They're concerned that they would lose access to vital information services like the National Public Warning System. Unlike its FM counterpart, AM radio signals travel long distances and pass through obstacles such as buildings, hills, and dense vegetation. These characteristics ensure that potentially life-saving information reaches a large audience, especially in rural areas with limited access to other forms of communication. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has also worked to reinforce AM radio base stations to mitigate risk resulting from events like natural disasters. And rural communities in particular rely on the service provided by AM radio, especially when they have only limited access to high-speed broadband and stream services, or they don't have any access at all. These services are important. They're important for farmers and ranchers who use AM radio to receive information on the weather, crop reports, and other vital information for their livelihoods. AM radio fosters a sense of local identity connecting people through regional programming that reflects the unique perspectives and traditions of their communities. Local media on AM radio is closer to the people, telling the stories and sharing the perspectives that the national news doesn't always cover and sometimes ignores. And it plays a crucial role in government accountability, acting as a watchdog for local school boards, county officials, regional courts, and other government bodies. Further, AM radio continues to be a key outlet for talk radio shows to connect with audiences across the country. Rush Limbaugh, for example, had around 15 million listeners tuning in each week to his show, which was broadcast across 650 stations at its peak. These are vital sources of information that keep people engaged and connected to their local community, region, and voices and perspectives they value in their lives. Whether they're tuning in for the local news, agricultural, or weather reports, information during an emergency, or to listen to their favorite talk show personality, AM radio continues to be a popular way for Americans to stay connected. I look forward to our discussion today, and I'm grateful for our experts for being here on the panel to share our goal to both celebrate American innovation and ensure people can use this critical communications tool and listen to AM radio stations important to them. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Lauda. AM radio stations play a critical role in our nation's communications network, and that's why I was so concerned when some automakers recently announced that they were planning to phase out AM radio from their electric vehicle models. I know firsthand how important AM radio can be during an emergency. In October 2012, after pummeling the Caribbean, Superstorm Sandy slammed the New Jersey coast with 80-mile-per-hour sustained winds and rain. There was extensive flooding and damage along the coasts of New Jersey and New York, including many of the beach and bayshore towns in my district. States as far west as Kentucky suffered power outages that lasted for days. Communications infrastructure was heavily damaged, including 25% of cellular towers across 10 states. Now, some of my constituents went days without power and telephone and internet connections, largely isolated and seeking whatever information they could get. A number of them relied on broadcast AM radio stations to get up-to-the-minute information like where to get water, gas, and groceries. And in some cases, their best source for AM radio was their vehicle. So that's why I was so troubled to learn that EV manufacturers had made the unilateral decision to remove AM radio from their cars, and as I understand it, without notice to consumers who have, for the most part, gotten used to having AM radio as part of a standard auto package. I'm proud of this committee's bipartisan work to encourage and promote more resilient communications networks, including my Sandy Act. And with the growing prevalence and reliability of wireless alerting systems, some people may wonder why we are concerned about the loss of AM tuners in cars, particularly given newer technology like satellites and IP networks. The answer is that AM has proven its value in emergency situations, which is particularly important now as the worsening climate crisis unleashes new and more powerful storms around the country. Despite our continued efforts to make cellular towers and equipment more resilient, they're still vulnerable during extreme weather events. Last week, when a typhoon hit Guam, preliminary press reports suggested that many cellular towers and FM stations throughout the island were knocked out, but AM stations stayed on the air. AM radio broadcast stations are the backbone of the emergency alert system infrastructure, which delivers critical safety alerts during public emergencies. During cellular network outages, AM broadcast frequencies are still able to travel 100 miles or more to deliver public safety communications. So it's no wonder that 7 former Federal Emergency Management Agency administrators wrote to Transportation Secretary Buttigieg earlier this year, urging the federal government to seek assurances from auto manufacturers to preserve AM radio access in vehicles for public safety. And we can't be satisfied by reliance on emergency content delivered through internet or satellite services that require a subscription or data plans. These services put consumers on the hook for additional monthly or annual costs. The government makes our country's electromagnetic airways available at no charge to broadcasters, who then carry these important alerts and messages to the public at no cost. So we must ensure this vital information is free to consumers. Now, thankfully, AM content is not just emergency and disaster information. For most of the time, broadcast programming content runs the gamut. In fact, according to the FCC, AM stations are more likely than FM stations or other kinds of media outlets to be owned by women and Black or Hispanic Americans. As we look to increase media diversity, we should keep in mind that AM radio is an important part of our nation's multicultural media programming. These are the main reasons that we simply cannot allow EV manufacturers now or in the future to remove AM radio from their EV models. So I want to thank Chairs Rogers and Latta, Ranking Member Matsui, also Mr. Pence, for basically taking the lead in holding this important hearing and dealing with this issue. I also would like to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Chris DeMays, who was the commanding officer of the Emergency Management Section of the New Jersey Office of Emergency Management. Thanks for being here today. Over the years, he's also led emergency responses to hurricanes and other disasters throughout the country. So we appreciate you joining us today to share your expertise and perspective on the importance of AM radio to emergency management. And thank you for all that you do for New Jersey. Now, of course, I've been mentioning New Jersey quite a bit, but I don't think there's anything I said that doesn't apply to the rest of the country as well, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. We want to thank our witnesses for being with us today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. You will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from the members. I would like to note for our witnesses that you'll see the timer boxes right there in front of you so that when the light will turn yellow, you will have 1 minute remaining. And when it turns red, your time has expired. One other thing I'd like to note is we have a second subcommittee in Energy and Commerce running today, so we have members that will be stepping out to go to that committee, subcommittee upstairs. So it's not that people are just leaving, they just have to go to another subcommittee. So I just want to alert you to that. We have 3 witnesses for the hearing today, including Mr. Jerry Chapman, President of Wolf Boom Radio, Mr. Scott Schmidt, Vice President, Safety Policy Alliance for Automotive Innovation, and Lieutenant Colonel Christopher DeMays, Homeland Security Branch Commander, New Jersey State Police. And again, we appreciate you all being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. And Mr. Chapman, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairs Latta and McMorris Rogers, Ranking Members Matsui and Pallone, and members of this subcommittee. My name is Jay Chapman. I am the president and owner of Wolf Boom Radio. We operate 12 radio stations serving Indiana and Ohio. 3 of those radio stations are AM radio stations. In Lima, it's WCIT. In Anderson, it is WHBU. And in Muncie, it's WMUN. I also appreciate the opportunity to testify on behalf of the National Association of Broadcasters and more than 6,400 local television and radio stations that provide free and valuable service to our hometowns every day. I'd like to take a quick moment and share a personal story about the role of AM in times of a crisis. In June of 2009, I was the general manager of a group of radio stations in Rockford, Illinois. I was returning home that evening with our 11-year-old daughter, and she looked to the sky to the south, and she saw a glow. A few minutes earlier, before that, a train, a Canadian national train, going through a suburb in southern Rockford had derailed. It was a train carrying 2 million gallons of ethanol at the time. 19 of the cars derailed, some of those cars leaked, and there was a fire that resulted quickly after that. That fire ensnared the cars at a crossing that was right by that, and quickly people were injured, and unfortunately that day a life was lost. Within minutes of that derailment, our radio station started broadcasting news of it to the community and telling people what they needed to do. We worked closely with local officials to coordinate a response and direct people to safety. It was our AM radio station that night, WNTA in Rockford, Illinois, that got people to safety and explained what they needed to do that evening. As bad as it was, if it was not for the emergency management officials that night, working with everybody throughout that area, it would have been much more tragic. I can tell you that AM radio that evening played a very important role in doing something that a cell phone delivering a text message cannot do at that time. AM radio explains, gives fabric and understanding to an emergency situation. The AM radio stations also play a central role in our emergency alert system. The vast majority of the AM radio station, or the PEP stations, which are the primary entry point which fires at the beginning of a presidential alert, are AM radio stations. These stations have been selected because many of them have a coverage area of some 700 miles. AM radio stations also penetrate solid objects like mountains. FEMA has invested millions to make these stations withstand natural disasters and acts of terrorism. But the stations themselves are responsible in those moments for operating in times of crisis. A car is oftentimes the only source of power and news during an emergency. People depend on that. Unlike the internet and cell phones, which oftentimes go down in a moment of crisis, the AM radio stations and radio in general stays up during that. Despite AM's critical role, some of the automakers have removed it from electric vehicles, and there are also discussions to remove it from internal combustion cars. Broadcasters want to thank Chairman Latta and Representative Greg Pence and multiple members of this subcommittee for sending a letter to the automakers signaling the importance. Local broadcasters were also pleased as a result of this letter that Ford announced a decision to reverse its course. We applaud that decision. A bipartisan bill has also been introduced, and like other safety requirements, the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act would preserve AM radio in cars by requiring the Transportation Secretary to issue a rule under which motor vehicles would be required to include a device that can receive AM radio. Broadcasters, of course, support this legislation. In conclusion, this is not a zero-sum game. We can protect Americans the way we always have with a dependable system of EAS that works in times of emergency. We also can protect the interference to electronics and the occupants of cars, as automakers have done for many years. This moment right now is too important not to take this action. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward to your questions.